For as long as wrestling has been an organized sport, there have been people writing about it, from newspapers to publications of all kinds. There's the police gazettes of old talking about wrestlers like Frank Gotch and Dr. Benjamin Roller, to the online articles of today talking about the sport. As for the publication that you have definitely never heard of, we're heading into the late 1920s and early 1930s to talk about a magazine I brought up in my wrestling books video, The Arena. A publication not only dedicated to wrestling, which is what I know the magazine best for, but dedicated to sports in general. Their beginning, their evolution, and their murky end I will attempt to cover as information is scarce. So let's enter The Arena. Heading back to the 1920s, the first true publication dedicated to wrestling was The Wrestling News, which got started in the early 20s, done by a Mr. John Reed out of Kansas City, Missouri. The aforementioned Police Gazette had wrestling stars and other sports people on the cover well before this, but this was the first to cover primarily wrestling, and of course sports magazines were around decades before this. Starting in 1928 was The Arena, the next big publication to come around to talk about professional wrestling that a consumer could buy. Other sports such as baseball and boxing had coverage before, but Arena wrapped it all up in a nice, neat bundle covering everything. As far as I could find, its first issue was released in December of 1928 and had Jack Dempsey on the cover. One of the greatest boxers of all time, his influence on the sport is second only to guys like Ali or Liston or especially Tyson, who Dempsey helped inspire and influence. The Arena continued strong into 1929 with issues having covers of guys like Babe Ruth, Jack Sharkey, who was another great old boxer, Lou Gehrig, and many other legends. Primarily, the Arena covers and main stories pertain to three sports: boxing, wrestling, and baseball. Fitness and bodybuilding would come just a little later as one of the recurring articles in these magazines, besides the other sports mentioned. The first to feature a wrestler was in September of 1929 and had Dick Schickett on the cover. Here's the issue which I possess. Gotta be careful with it, this thing is getting close to being 100 years old and the cover here is falling apart a bit, as you can see. The first article inside is about the cover star, Dick Schickett, one of the great old wrestlers of the 20s and 30s, a world champion and a hell of a shooter. Besides the primary world title, Schickett also held the National Wrestling Association title, being the inaugural champion. There's great articles inside. Here's one talking about the, at the time, Philadelphia Athletics. The Arena was really high on Connie Mack at the time, and rightfully so, considered one of the greatest managers and players there ever was. Here's one talking about Lou Darrow, a promoter from the Los Angeles area, up there when talking about great wrestling promoters of the past, like Paul Bowser, Jack Curley, Jack Pfeffer, and Ray Fabiani, etc. Coolest of all inside this particular issue is this article talking about Jess McMahon, Vince McMahon's grandfather. He was a boxing and wrestling promoter, and this article discusses McMahon being Tex Rickard's successor. Rickard himself was one of the greatest ever, having promoted boxing, founded the NHL team, the New York Rangers, and even oversaw the third incarnation of Madison Square Garden. Now that you have gotten a taste of what the Arena was like as a magazine, who put out the Arena? Where did they come from? According to the magazines, the Arena and its later sister publications were put out by, well, the Arena Publishing Corporation, which was based out of Philadelphia. To be specific, 2737 North Palethorpe Street. The street still exists and you can go to it on Google Street View. It's safe to assume that the publishing company ran out of this building here. Other than that, any other information about the Arena Publishing Corporation's history is virtually non-existent. Nothing has been recorded of what their offices looked like, where the magazines got sold, nothing. Carrying on, the Arena came out swinging and continued into 1930. Here's an issue I own with Gus Sonnenberg on the cover from March of 1930. Like Schickett before, Sonnenberg was a world champion and also a pro football player. Sonnenberg held not only the world title, the Gotch, Hackenschmidt, Caddick, Stecker, Lewis belt, but also the AWA title, the Boston version under Paul Bowser. Inside are articles about Sonnenberg, Primo Carnera, basketball, sumo wrestling. Here's one released just a couple months later in May with John Pasek, the Nebraska Tiger Man, on the cover. Pasek is considered one of the finest wrestlers of all time, having wrestled from the 19-teens until the 1930s. He was also a champion, having held the aforementioned National Wrestling Association title. Insider articles about Pasek, some baseball stats for the 1930 season, Jim McMillan coming in as a wrestler, the same Jim McMillan who sold out Madison Square Garden in 1931 with Jim Londos. And when McMillan played pro football before getting into wrestling, he played with Red Grange. There's even an article on bicycle racing, Mexican boxer Joe Guerrero, no relation to the wrestling family, and bodybuilding. The last one I'll show is one I showed previously during my video talking about wrestling books, the Arena magazine from November of 1930 with Strangler Lewis on the cover. There's actually a lot of boxing related articles in this one. I do have one more which is from August of 1931 with world champion Ed Don George on the cover. I won't be flipping through that one as the pages are brittle and flake when touched, so best I leave that one alone. The Arena would even go so far as to put certain guys on the cover of an issue twice, like Jim Londos or Jack Dempsey. Going by the fact that I have one from 1931, Arena continues strong into even that year. December of 1931 also gave me my favorite cover of any Arena or even any wrestling adjacent magazine ever put out. This Londos cover just oozes aura and looks so damn cool. This is my wrestling white whale that I hope one day to catch, more than anything, more than any autograph, more than any poster, anything. Going into 1932, Arena started out with Henry DeGlane as the cover star for the January issue, the very same Henry DeGlane who earlier in May of 1931 had screwed over Strangler Lewis for the AWA title in Montreal, screaming and showing that Lewis had bitten him when that wasn't the case and he was awarded the belt via disqualification. However, it wouldn't be long before the Arena would unfortunately come to an end, as just a couple months later, the last issue was put out. As far as my research could take me, this April 1932 issue with Johnny Jadek on the cover was the last Arena magazine ever put out. Now, just because the Arena was finished doesn't mean the Arena Publishing Corporation was. Just a month later, in May of 1932, they would put out the first issue of an all-new publication, Boxing and Wrestling News, and it only made sense for the first issue to have the man who, adjusted for inflation, drew more money than Hulk Hogan and Stone Cold Steve Austin on the cover, Jim Londos. Boxing and Wrestling News would be really no different from the Arena, having a lot of the same layout, same journalists, and the covers would have wrestling, boxing, and even baseball guys on the covers, despite the name of Boxing and Wrestling News. Babe Ruth, Jack Dempsey, Henry DeGlane, Jack Sharkey, and many others. Here's one I have from July of 1932 with Dick Schickhead on the cover. This one is pretty fragile, so I won't be flipping through it. However, I will flip through this one I have from March of 1933 with one of the Deus Ex on the cover. Despite being on the cover, the Deus Ex aren't the first story you flip to. They're after articles on boxers Young Corbett and Johnny Indrisano. The coolest of all is the story inside talking about a war between Dick Daviscourt, a wrestler from Ellensburg in my home state, and Fred Grubmeyer, the Iowa cornstalk, the man whose expeditions in using old carny tactics and shoot tactics to clean a town out of money were so legendary that they're mentioned in Fall Guys and Luthez's autobiography, Hooker. Unfortunately, unlike the Arena, Boxing and Wrestling News would last nowhere near as long. Its final issue, as far as my research could tell me, was in July of 1933 with boxer Barney Ross on the cover. Following this, the Arena Publishing Corporation never put out another publication following this. Maybe. It would be silly if I ended the video here, but there is another publication that I feel needs mentioning, the Arena and Strength, put out in 1932 and ran up until the mid-30s. You would think that this was definitely another publication put out by the Arena Publishing Corporation, but it wasn't. These were put out by the Milo Publishing Company, located on the same street in the same building and everything, just a different part of the building. The Milo Publishing Company and their products actually got advertising in the Arena magazines. Makes sense since they were neighbors, might as well do some shoutouts. The Milo Publishing Company and Milo Barbell products precede anything the Arena Publishing Corporation did by several years. Milo Publishing put out the magazine Strength, which ran from 1914 until around 1929 or 1930. One would guess that the Arena Publishing Corporation merged with the Milo Publishing Company during the run of Boxing and Wrestling News, hence the name of Arena and Strength combine the name of two magazines, but that remains unconfirmed. I doubt that's the case, so consider that a crack theory more than anything. Unfortunately, outside of the most gung-ho collectors out there who are in the know, the Arena and its subsequent works fell into obscurity, and that's a shame. I feel that the Arena fell into obscurity because of its short run and possible limited distribution, most likely being relegated to something found more in the Northeast. This is only a theory, as there just isn't enough information out there. I feel that if you're in any way interested in sports of all kinds, or even a particular sport like wrestling, boxing, baseball, all of that, I highly recommend finding and reading these magazines. The information inside and things you'll learn are tremendous, and they make for great additions to any collection of memorabilia. My Arena magazines are some of my prized possessions, and I hope to have a full set of every one that has a wrestler on the cover. And thank you for watching.